Opening slide graphic text title, The Connected Community with Cormac Russell. Image of Cormac Russell, text, Purpose Matters Conference, logos, Belonging Matters and talksthatmatter.net.
Good to be with you all, wherever you're calling in from. Just on a practical note, can I remind people that they're able to submit questions in the Q&A section, and we're very keen to receive your questions. Some of you, I think, are just joining in the last few minutes, so welcome. And please nestle in wherever you are calling in from around the world into a community conversation about the connected community. We just heard a little while ago Kevin sharing about the importance of ensuring that rights are experienced where we live our lives, and that rights are experienced in the day-to-day comings and goings of our neighborhood, our context, our village life. And in essence, that's what I'm here over the next 25 minutes to share some thoughts on from a book that John McKnight, who's the founder of Asset-Based Community Development, and I have written. And for those of you who don't know John McKnight, John is turning 91 in November, 91 years young. And over the last 70 years, he has really committed his life to precipitating and proliferating community-led action at neighborhood level, with a view to making sure that all really means all, and that everybody can experience a full life that's purposeful and citizenship-based. And that whole idea is an idea that's not just about individual rights. It's also a recognition that without a community where everybody's gifts are purposefully received, recognized, and loved, and missed on the days that they're not contributed, we're not actually a full society. And in many respects, I firmly believe that this book is an affirmation, not just of the inclusion movement, but also the environmental movement, the movement for more justice with respect to economic wealth, and a whole range of other movements which maybe don't think about themselves as having anything to gain from a conference like this. But wherever you're coming from, I think, with respect to human rights and with respect to inclusion and a better planet, I think this conference and what we have to say here is essential to the message of how we get better at being human together and walk more lightly on our planet. And the words that we use to express that are the connected community, a community where we move from an experience of disconnection to deep, purposeful connection. We are very privileged to have had Parker Palmer write the foreword to our new book. And Parker observes in the foreword that our disconnection from people and place diminishes our quality of life. And he goes on to say it also diminishes our quality of democracy. His view is that the reason that we've got so much polarization and so much extremism in our world today is because we have become so disconnected from each other, from our places, from local economies, and from our ecologies. It's not surprising in a lot of ways that we have become so disconnected, because modern life, I think, is perfectly structured to pull us apart and separate us from each other. And so in many respects, the three phases of the book really recognize and try to echo the phases of good community building. And I think a key message for conference I'd like to bring is I don't think that inclusion can be achieved solely through a person-centered lens, though that's important. We also have to take seriously the idea of a community-centered approach alongside a person-centered way of being in the world. And advocacy is central to that. So what does it mean to actually create a village where everybody's gift is recognized and received, particularly those that are pushed furthest to the margins? We believe that it means three things. The first, like the first chair you see here, three chairs. The first is to discover what we have within ourselves, within the people around us, particularly the people that we see as stranger or we don't see at all. So a radical commitment to discovery is the first step. The second step is to connect what we discover. And the third is to mobilize those connections into a better future, into an alternative preferred future. We can't just know what our connections are. We've actually got to act into them. So let's take each of those phases, the discover, connect, and mobilize. And in the brief time we have, let's say a word or two about each. So the discovery piece is important. And I know there are people who are listening in and partaking in this conference who feel very strongly that institutions need to show up in more sensitive and more proactive ways in their lives and in the lives of the people they love and their fellow citizens. And I think that's true. But in many respects, I often think about the way we think about inclusion as being like on a nighttime flight where we're looking out of the window, and in the darkness of the night, as we look down on our villages and our communities, all we really see are the places where the lights are on. We see the institutions. And if you could imagine being on such a nighttime flight and somebody leaning over, sitting beside you in the seat on the plane saying, where are the sources of power down there? I think you might be forgiven for answering, it's in the institutions, the schools, the hospitals, the jails, the prisons. Our book says that's the wrong answer. That even though as you're looking out of that window and all you see are the lights on in the institutions and the darkness, the dark matter of our neighborhoods, we want you to look again. We want you to look more closely at the places we call home. And we want to commend to you the idea that actually they are the true power sources of an inclusive society. And they've largely gone unnoticed and undiscovered. Part of the reason I think we're not discovering the potential power of our communities is because of their modesty, their ordinariness, but also because modern life tells us a story. And the story is that our lives and the lives of those we love most and who are most likely to be pushed to the edge will only get better if somebody from the private sector or from government or some big civil society charity who has enough money, enough expertise, enough know-how to come in and make it better. They will do something to us, for us, or if they're kindly folk, with us. But the idea that we ourselves, organized as citizens, can make change happen, that we can be a source of power, is an uncommon idea. No. The dominant story says we're clients of a service system, and the best we can hope to do is advocate for consumer rights. And you know, the sad reality is the better we get, the more likely we are to be defined out of citizenship and out of community and into service land, because that's where the source of power is. Well, that clearly isn't true. In all kinds of ways, we know that what creates a powerful, inclusive, and purposeful life is not institutionalization. And while institutions have an important role to play, it's actually a supplementary role, not a central one. And this is a challenge, I think, for many advocacy groups, because I think their story does not align with what I'm about to say. And maybe some of what I'm about to say is therefore controversial. But controversy isn't always a bad thing. So let me propose an alternative story to the story of separateness and the story that says the institutions are our best hope. This is a story that puts communities at the center. And by communities, I mean individuals, families, neighbors, the neighborhood, the village. In this image, what you see at the center are the gifts of every single individual without exception. Kevin reminded us in his sharing and his insight and opening address of the importance of recognizing that every single human being has a gift, that the community cannot be fully a community without. And until that gift is recognized, what in North Africa they call geni, where the word genius comes from, until that is recognized and received, the community is not yet a community. A gift is not a gift until it's given, it's said, but it's also not a gift until it's received. And far too many people live lives where their gifts are not valued or even recognized. That's the starting point, is to begin by discovering gifts, not deficits, not deficiencies, not maladies, not even needs, but gifts. And if we're interested in advocacy, really interested in advocacy, let us start our conversations with gifts, not needs. The needs will come, but we cannot know what a person needs until we know what their gifts are. So that's at the center. Around the gifts of the person, you see smaller circles. And those smaller circles represent the associations, the clubs, the groups, the social networks, many of whom do not have any formal structures. But those clubs, those groups, those associations are where friendships, where belonging, and where purpose is found. It's in those places beyond the medical model and beyond charity, in the ordinariness, that extraordinary experiences of belonging are experienced day to day. And it's in those places that on the days we do not show up, we are missed. Outside of that big circle are triangles, not-for-profit institutions, for-profit institutions, governmental institutions. These all play an important role. But as you can see in this slide, it's a supplementary role. Every winter, I get a little rundown at the beginning of the winter, and my wife reminds me of something I forget, which is, it's around about time you should take some supplements. You should take some vitamins to give you and your immune system a boost. She doesn't say, why don't you take vitamins in place of food? She says, take them as supplements. We should think about institutions the same way. They're not our food. They're our supplements. They serve us. It's really interesting to think about all those different elements as assets, particularly the local institutions that are in our communities, the local post offices, the local corner shops. So I don't want to disrespect or disregard institutions, but what I do want to do is call our attention to the importance of the local and to, again, feature that as such an essential scale at which we can make change happen. So we've talked a little bit about the importance of discovery, but it's not enough to discover the gifts of individuals, the power of associations, even the assets of local institutions. The economy and the ecology is also important, but to just discover them in their own right is not sufficient. We've also got to find ways of connecting those assets together. Connecting individual and associational assets is all about relationships. Whenever I work with First Nations communities, I'm greeted with expressions such as all my relations. That's an expression I first heard in Newfoundland in Canada, all my relations, which was a greeting of all of the relations of the elder who greeted me from their past, their future, and their present, their relationship to kin, their relationship to land, their relationship to their own story and the story yet to come. All of those relationships are connections and they matter deeply. The question we ask, I suppose, at the heart of it in our book, The Connected Community, is, are we in right relationship with each other, with our planet, with the other 8 million species that we share the planet with? And I think suggestions are rife at the moment that we're not. So how do we get in right relationship? Well, that's about getting into connections that make a difference. I wanted to share a brief story with you from Sardinia, a little village called Ulisse, where Maria Lei, a famous Italian artist, back in the late 70s, early 80s, began a project where she engaged 1,000 people in the village of Ulisse in a conversation, a community conversation that ultimately revolved around connection. It was a village that was fraught with all kinds of conflict and all kinds of disconnection and quite a lot of violence linked to First and Second World War. As an artist, she was invited to do an art project with the community in 1979. She eventually finished it in 1981. And ultimately, the project revolved around a story that nearly everybody in the village told her when she sat and had community conversations with them. It was a story about a young girl who one day went into the foothills that you can see there behind the village in the picture. And you can see the picture of Marie with the threads between her fingers there, and beside it, the village. Well, right into those mountains, a young girl brought some milk and sandwiches to a shepherd's. And as she arrived by where the shepherds were, a storm blew in, a very, very dangerous storm. So the shepherds took shelter in the caves in the hillside. But as they were doing that, the little girl ran right into the eye of the storm, pursuing a sky blue Marion-colored ribbon, and she disappeared out of sight. Eventually, as the story goes, she caught the ribbon and she returned. But when she returned to the cave, a landslide had caused the cave to be completely closed off, and sadly, the shepherds died. Nobody knows if that story is true or false, but it became the inspiration for one of the most inspiring arts projects I've ever come across, which entailed the tying together of all of the houses in that village with 27 kilometers of sky blue ribbon. You can see the children holding the ribbon here. It seems like such a motherhood and apple pie story to share at a conference about purpose and belonging. But what really strikes me is that 40 years on, that exercise became the foundation, almost like the fabric that connected this community together in a way that they were unable to connect each other or with each other previously. But there's a little sting to the tale, because the night before the project was about to take place, a number of very vocal neighbors protested and said they didn't want the project to go ahead. They said they thought it was fake and artificial and didn't really reflect the truth of their village, which was that lots and lots of people were traumatized and were angry and didn't actually feel connected to their neighbors. And why should they engage in a pretense and this fancy idea of connecting their village together in this way? Well, as with all good community conversations, all doubts are welcome, and conflict, if it's properly processed, can actually be part of the creative process. And so they came up with a solution. They came up with what they call a tie code. And this is where they tied different houses together to represent the real relationships that were in place. So where there were difficulties and the relationships were strained, they didn't do anything other than just stretch the blue ribbon across the edges or the corners of the house to show the tension that was in place between the houses. Where there was love and affection, there were knots. Where there was deep love, such as a marriage, loaves of bread were tied. And so that day in 1981, they tied 27 kilometers worth of sky blue ribbon through all of these houses. And 40 years later, this is one of the most inclusive places I know in the world. Sardinia, interestingly, is one of the blue zones. It's one of the places where we have the most, one of 5 places where we have the most centurions, the most people living over the age of 100. It's also a deeply inclusive place because everybody gets to bring their skills, knowledge, gifts, and talents to making sure that this village is vibrant economically, and socially. What we can see in villages like Ulase are 7 functions being performed by the local people with the support of institutions in a supplementary way. I don't have time to go into the detail of these, but let me just mention 1 or 2. So in terms of health, if you're interested and you're listening and perhaps you're maybe a little bit doubtful of what I'm saying, let me give you some of the science around health. 85% of what determines our health and well-being has nothing at all got to do with medicine. In fact, what it has to do with is our community assets. Community has far more capacity to be health producing and health creating than any medicine or any doctor. How do we therefore ensure that our communities are sufficiently connected and sufficiently health producing, when so often what we're doing is making our communities dependent on pharmacology and dependent on medicine? 27% of most people who are at the doctor today are not biomedically ill. They're lonely. There is no medical cure for loneliness. There is only one response, and that's community. It's the same with security. All the social science shows us that actually what determines security is how many neighbors you know by first name and how often you associate with each other in the built environment. And yet over and over again, we hear stories about security being tied to more policing, more CCTV cameras, more surveillance, more speed bumps on our streets. This just simply is bad science. It's bad policy, and it's burning an awful lot of our professionals out to boot. It's an unhelpful story, and it's not a story that feeds belonging. It's certainly not a story that feeds purpose. It feeds fear, it feeds dependency, and it feeds separateness. How do we move past that story? We move past that story by moving towards associational life and recognizing we can't know what communities need until we know what communities have. And associational life is something we have in abundance if we're prepared to discover, connect, and mobilize. Associations are able to do what professionals can't. They have the Heineken strategy. They reach the parts that other parts of society can't. They reach people in ways that institutions and services can't. They shape our behaviors and they enable us to act differently. What I mean by associations are the clubs, the groups, the informal associational networks that enable us to take individual gifts and to amplify and multiply those gifts. In many practical senses, we all have gifts worth sharing. Some people on this call may be beautiful singers, but regardless of how good you are at singing, you will never be a choir on your own. Associational life is what allows us to take individual competencies and capabilities and amplify and multiply them so that we can do together what we cannot do alone. And that's why I think associational life is so important and so worth mobilizing if we're serious about belonging and we're serious about purposeful and meaningful lives. Mobilizing to action means we can't think our way into this new idea. We've got to live our way together into this new idea. And that starts by recognizing that we grow from ground up, from inside out, not outside in. Belonging and purpose doesn't happen by getting institutions to do to us or for us. It happens by us starting to recognize that there are irreplaceable functions that we, our families and our associations have, for which there is no governmental proxy. There is only us. And if we have the power and we have democratic services and institutions that serve us and open up space for us to do that, then we have the capability of moving from doing things ourselves to doing things in partnership with agencies, and also finally holding outside agencies to account. It's almost like a 3-lane swimming pool where there are certain things we can do ourselves that create purpose, certain things we can do that require some help, but in service of us. not dominating over us, and certain other things in the third lane we do need done for us, but we need to get the relationships right. And so here's my challenge as I finish. We, I believe, have spent too long in the third lane doing things to people and for people without first understanding what it is they themselves can do for themselves with their neighbours. We need to change. Let's start a different conversation in a different space. Let's recognize we cannot know what communities need until communities first know what they have. And that starts by recognizing that those who are first at the table should be those that have been pushed furthest to the margins. Ultimately, the kind of change that we're advocating for here can only really come about when people who've been defined as the problem secure the power to redefine the problem. And on the day they do, we will move from talking about problems to moving to an alternative future and recognize the real possibility that living together brings. Thank you.
Closing slide graphic text with thanks to Cormac Russell, CrowdComms Purpose Matters Conference 2022. This video was made possible with the support of an information and capacity building grant through the Department of Social Services, produced by Belonging Matters. Belonging Matters makes every effort to provide accurate and up-to-date material. However, information is subject to change, and are materials for reference only. This video was filmed on the land of the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung peoples of the Eastern Kulin Nation. Logos Belonging Matters talksthatmatter.net.
Graphic text. More Purpose Matters conference videos. To watch more videos from the Purpose Matters conference, please head to free videos on the Talks That Matter website, talksthatmatter.net. Logos Belonging Matters, Talks That Matter.